Good afternoon, and thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar on the good, bad, and ugly in LatAm logistics. My name is Abel Delgado. I am the Digital Marketing Director for America's Market Intelligence, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's event. So before we get started, I just want to go over a couple of things in terms of what you can expect. The presentation should last anywhere between 30 and 45 minutes, after which we'll have a period for questions. You can ask questions at any point in time during the webinar. Whenever something occurs to you, by all means, ask us. The way to do it is if you look at your user panel, you're going to see an icon there that says Q&A, and you click on that. It brings up a window. You write in the question and send it to us, and then we'll answer as many as we can towards the end of the webinar. So just fire away whenever you like. One question we also get a lot of times is, are the materials going to be available after the webinar? And the answer to that is yes, 100%. We basically take the webinar video, edit it a little bit, and then send it off to all the registrants along with the presentation slides. So you definitely will receive those materials after the event. So let's move on a little bit to talk about the legal notice here real quick. So this basically just covers our responsibility, and that we've done the best that we can to verify the information, but we can't be held responsible in terms of business decisions and such if they go wrong because of the information shared here today. I don't want to belabor the proceedings by reading it line by line, but please take a look at that at your own leisure, and that way you'll understand sort of what's going on with the legal notice. Let's go on to the next slide. So a little bit about who we are, because you may or may not know us. So we have been around for the past 30 years or so, working specifically in Latin America and in a variety of different sectors. And what we do is basically provide data and market intelligence for the energy industry, as well as a number of other industries. So we've done about 4,000 or so projects, and a lot of the work that we do essentially revolves around giving companies not only data and market research and things like that, but also strategic guidance, because we understand how the market moves and the different things that are happening, so that they can have that greater context, and then people can use that in companies to make better decisions, find opportunities, defend themselves against competition, et cetera, et cetera. So this gives you sort of the overview as to who we are. And as you can see there, it's a significant amount of experience, a lot of projects, and more than 400 subcontractors located around Latin America that help us execute our energy projects and the other projects too for our different specialties. So as we look here in terms of our structure, basically we have a structure that's around the different region. Miami is our headquarters, of course, and that's where a lot of our practice leaders are. And then we have another one in San Francisco. But then we have practice leaders and project managers, not practice leaders, but rather project managers in a variety of other cities, as you can see, in Sao Paulo, in Medellin, Santiago, Buenos Aires, Ciudad de Mexico. So we have a number of different people there too. So that's part of our presence in the region. So let's move on to the next slide. Now I'm going to turn the floor over to Arthur Deakin, who is the director of our energy practice, so we can talk a little bit more specifically about what we offer in terms of energy, and also talk about, well, the presentation itself, the good, bad, and ugly, what it means, and then get right into it. Arthur.
Thank you, Abel. Appreciate that intro. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Happy that you guys could make it. So this presentation is going to be a little bit different, because it's not going to be as structured. Of course, there's going to be some slides that you guys will receive after the fact, but we really want you as an audience to ask as many questions as you want, and I'll do my best to answer them. Can't guarantee that we'll have the answer for all of them, but definitely we'll do our best here to try and get the information for you. So just in terms of some of the services that we provide here at AMI, these names might appear a bit strange if you've never worked with us in the past, or if you've never worked with market research, but essentially we're trying to answer questions such as, how should I enter this market? What's the size of the market? What's the demand looking like? What are end consumers looking for? Who should I partner with? What kind of local company should I partner with? What are my competitors doing? How are they structuring their contracts? Who are their clients? What is their market share? So all of those things, all those questions that are related to a market-facing decision are things that we answer in the energy practice and in our other practices as well. So just moving on to the next slide. This is just to show some of our coverage in terms of topics in the energy sector. And the way we have it separated here is upstream, midstream, and downstream. So upstream, anything to do with energy generation. And here we've covered everything from solar and wind to green and blue hydrogen. And then midstream, it's more focused on transportation, transmission, and distribution of electricity and energy. And then the downstream is the the consumption by end users, and that's more electric vehicles, biofuels, and heat pumps. So we cover the entire supply chain. Moving on to the next slide, please. So before we get started on the good, bad, and ugly, which is the main theme of this conversation, I wanted to provide sort of context of what we're seeing, what we've been hearing with our conversations with our clients and different energy players across the region and the world. So what's top of mind for us, and it's something that seems to be top of mind for many governments and big energy players across the world, is how to achieve this energy trifecta, right? So it's affordable energy, it's reliable energy, and it's low carbon energy. And I really believe that the priorities are really in that order. So first, how to get affordable energy to our population, to our end users, how to make it reliable and secure, so there's no blackouts, there's no dependence on autocratic nations. And then lastly, if possible, after getting the affordable and reliable energy, how do we make it low carbon? I think the carbon footprint here is no longer the most important focus for emerging markets. I think in Europe and the US, to an extent, it still is very important, probably similar to affordable and reliable energy. But in emerging markets like Latin America, the low carbon footprint is less important than having affordable and reliable energy. The good news globally is that in 2022, it was the first time ever that we saw investments in low carbon energy match investments in fossil fuels. They were both just over 1 trillion, and I think they may have been 1.1 trillion each. And low carbon, of course, includes everything under that bracket. So it could be solar and wind, it could be green hydrogen, it could be developing charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, it could be developing biofuel facilities. So anything that is low carbon, essentially, that's not oil and gas as we know it. So that, for the first time ever in 2022, matched the investment made in fossil fuels. But the reality is that to stay within the Paris agreements, which is the 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures, we need to spend, for every dollar we spend on fossil fuels, so on oil and gas infrastructure, on exploration, etc., we need to spend 4 on renewables, so 4x. And right now we're 1-to-1 parity. So we're still quite far away from reaching our investment targets, from staying on track to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's the next few years through 2025 is really going to give us a lot of direction on whether or not the 1.5 degree target is actually realistic. As of now, it doesn't seem like it. It seems like the world is starting to adapt to 2 degrees, or somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees as the realistic target. One reason why it's been so hard to match or increase the low carbon investment is because it's become increasingly hard to get low cost capital, and that's a byproduct of rising interest rates across the world. In emerging markets, that's even worse where inflation is quite high. The currencies are weak, so interest rates have to go higher quicker. And that's a reality we're seeing across the region. In Mexico, from some of the work we've done in the past couple of weeks, we see the cost of capital around 12 to 13% if you're going to finance a project, in a solar or wind project, for example, in Mexico. And the returns are just not following that increase. So it's becoming increasingly hard to find profitable opportunities. And then when you're looking at more risky jurisdictions such as Honduras and Guatemala, in Central America, the cost of capital is 18, 19, even 20%. So that makes it very hard to find projects that will get you net returns above that. 5 years ago, 2017, 2018, we know that the cost of capital for large scale projects in Mexico was around 6%, so half of what we're seeing today, or even smaller than that. And they had IRRs of 10%, so you did have real net returns of 3 to 4%. Now it's getting much harder to see those numbers. The good thing is that there's no denying that the demand for electricity is going to continue to grow globally, but also in Latin America. And much of that electricity is going to be satisfied through newly installed solar and wind power and other types of renewable technologies. So the IEA, which is a reference for energy research as well, they predict that renewable power capacity in Latin America is going to grow 45% in the next 5 years. So quite a large increase. And that is going to create a lot of opportunities, not only in the generation aspect of it, but also how to transport it to the end users, how to structure contracts that make sense for both the off takers and the generators, how to make work with commercializers of that energy. So the entire supply chain, there are opportunities when it comes to the generation of renewable power. So just moving on to the next slide. So this is just an overview of some of the mega trends we're seeing. So there's around 6 exactly, or 5 and 1 honorable mention. So one thing that we're seeing is this continued acceleration of natural gas use in LatAm, and the growth of LNG, liquefied natural gas exports. So Peru has seen quite a growth in LNG. Mexico is developing a lot of LNG plants to export to Asia, through the Pacific, and then to Europe through the Gulf. Guyana is still quite far away from that, but there's possibility of using excess gas there from their recent finds into LNG. So gas is not going away, especially in emerging markets. Another thing we're seeing is the really rapid growth of distributed generation. I won't touch too much on that because we'll talk about it later. The success of green hydrogen, but not necessarily green hydrogen used for electricity or for heat, but more for the production of derivatives. So the derivatives, I mean, ammonia or green methanol. So using the hydrogen molecule that's produced via renewable power to produce some of these derivatives. Also, another thing that we see is LatAm becoming a source of feedstock for renewable fuels. So Latin America is well located, strategically located close to some of the production facilities in Canada and the US, and also has a large source of biomass. So used cooking oil, you'll hear me talk about this a little bit later, is a major opportunity. And then we're also seeing some limited adoption of some of these more advanced technologies. So battery storage solutions, and that's because of high import taxes and also poor regulation that's not incentivizing the acceleration of those technologies. And same with electric vehicles. It's not really growing at a rapid pace throughout the region. So I'll just stop there. If there's any questions, please go ahead, use the Q&A. Happy to answer them as we go along or at the end. But now we'll get into the good, bad, and ugly, which is the bulk of this presentation. So the good. The big picture here is that Latin America has all the pieces in place to become a key provider in the energy transition. I think Latin America has always been the continent of the future, right? I'm Brazilian. You always hear that Brazil is going to, boom 10 years down the road, and that 10 years just keeps on being postponed because the country and the region tend to fail to reach its potential. And most of it is a byproduct of poor politics and sometimes weak institutions. But this time around, it does have all the pieces, or most of the pieces in place to become a key supplier in this transition, in this clean energy transition. So why do I say that? Well, LatAm has the majority of green minerals used for a lot of the transmission infrastructure, a lot of the electric vehicles. So that includes lithium and copper, which is big in Chile, Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, Brazil to an extent. They also have a very low cost. The region also has a very low cost of renewable power in countries such as Chile and Brazil, which will allow it to become one of the cheapest producers of green hydrogen in the world. And when considering green hydrogen across globally, the costs are a major source of whether it will accelerate quickly enough, because at right now it's just not feasible to produce green hydrogen in many of the countries outside of Latin America. The other thing that's also not focused necessarily on renewables, but on creating cleaner sources of fuel, is that LatAm has cheap and low sulfur crude, especially in Brazil, in Guyana, potentially in Suriname, still up in the air whether the discoveries there are going to materialize. But in a world where we're looking to reduce our carbon footprint in any way possible, having low sulfur crude replace some of the heavy fuel oil, which is more extensive and more complicated when refining, is a big opportunity. And then lastly, like I mentioned, LatAm has a massive source of biomass that can be used to produce a variety of clean fuels, such as sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel. So if we move on to the next slide, I think the main takeaway here is that LatAm as a whole has many different countries that have the necessary materials or sources to provide producers of clean fuels the necessary biomass so that they can succeed. So a big problem across the world is the lack of access to feedstock for the production of renewable fuels. So sustainable aviation fuel is a renewable fuel, renewable diesel is a renewable fuel, biodiesel, another type of renewable fuel. Lots of these fuels, they're produced from waste. So from waste from agriculture, waste from cooking, waste from forestry, all of these different types of waste streams, which are present across many of these different countries in LatAm, are going to be highly sought out. So there's producers of sustainable aviation fuel that have been sold out for years to come because essentially they can't get access to higher amounts of feedstock. So they're delaying the construction of new capacity of new production plants because they can't get access to this feedstock. So that's where Latin America can play a role. Mexico and Colombia, both of which are very close to the US and have decent infrastructure and have many of these feedstocks, will be probably the best positioned to supply those materials to producers, to the big names that are producing these renewable fuels globally. If we move on to the next slide, I think distributed generation is another good in Latin America. It doesn't face as many of the regulatory obstacles that we see in utility scale. So here are some of the growth rates we're seeing for some of the major markets in the region. So Panama seeing 23x from 2022 to 2030. Of course, Panama is starting from a smaller base, but that's still a pretty significant number when you think about it. Brazil, Mexico, Chile, all over 2x growth between 2022 and 2030. And what we see is that some of these newer distributed generation markets, so the less mature ones, will be the ones that will see fastest growth because regulatory frameworks are still subsidizing some of the distributed generation installations. In the more mature markets like Mexico and Brazil, there's already a phase out of those subsidies, so the growth rates will likely start to decrease. Brazil, Mexico, and Chile are some of the more mature markets there. The utility scale challenges, large scale solar, large scale wind, is something that is going to be addressed in the bad, but essentially it's a byproduct of poor infrastructure, poor transmission infrastructure across the region. So if you move on to the next slide, please. And as I mentioned, Latin America will have one of the lowest costs in the world for producing green hydrogen, and that's a direct result of low cost of renewable power. There's areas in Chile, in the Atacama Desert, and also in the south with very cheap wind that are expected to produce hydrogen the lowest cost in the world. So here are some of the costs we're seeing for hydrogen production. This doesn't consider transport, storage, nor distribution costs. It's just the pure production cost of using renewable electrolysis to produce hydrogen. The global average is 295 for 2030. These numbers are all for 2030. So many countries here in LatAm, Chile, Uruguay, Brazil, Peru, and even Colombia, which is a little bit higher, will be significantly lower than the global average. So that means that they'll be able to produce a lot of this green hydrogen and the derivatives that come with it and export it to markets such as Europe, the US, Asia, etc. Moving on to the next slide. Most of the focus of the green hydrogen is going to be on derivative exports. So it's very complicated to transport hydrogen, not only because of cost, but also the density of the gas is still something that people haven't really figured out, is how to transport it through different continents. You can transport it via pipelines, but transport it via ship is still not feasible. So what these producers of green hydrogen are going to do is use that molecule, the gas hydrogen molecule, to produce ammonia or methanol, which are easier to transport and can be used for several other sources, either in the chemical sector or as fuel sources themselves. So we've seen that over actually 65% of the projects, the green hydrogen projects announced in LatAm, are going to be focused on ammonia or methanol production. And most of this is going to be for exports because there's no domestic market for some of these chemicals. There is a little bit, but not sizable markets. So they'll be looking at Europe, US, and Asia to export some of these products. If we move on to the next slide, please. Just touching on the bad and the ugly. We consolidated here the bad and ugly. In our article, we separated them both, but just for the sake of time, we grouped them together. But the reality is that there's not much in the bad that doesn't overlap with the ugly. You know, I would say that the bad itself is underinvestment in transmission. That's causing congestion, it's causing blackouts, it's causing higher electricity prices. There's poor regulations, not developed regulations, and very high import costs. These are delaying the adoption of some of these next generation technologies, such as battery. The cost of capital that I've mentioned is becoming prohibitively high to finance projects, so that's delaying some of the necessary investments in the region. And then the ugly is really the politics, and there's three different politicians here that have been impacting the energy sector for the worse more than others, and that's Gustavo Petro in Colombia, Lula in Brazil, and AMLO in Mexico. So moving on to the next slide. One major problem, one of the bad things in LatAm is that the infrastructure, the transmission grids are obsolete and congested. So, for example, in the US, we see smart grid penetration 98%. In Brazil, it was 2% in early 2022. So it's a massive discrepancy. It means that there's been energy losses, that the distribution of electricity is not being as efficient as it could be. It means that costs are higher than they should be. And it's also, if we move on to the next slide, we'll see it's also a reason why lots of this solar and wind pipeline is being stalled and delayed, because there's no points of interconnection for these generation projects that have been announced. So the reality is that of the total solar pipeline that's been announced, under construction, it's usually in LatAm less than 10%. So Chile 10%, Colombia 9%, Brazil 8%, and Peru 4%. The US, it's much higher, especially since the IRA was approved. We're now seeing 25% of the solar pipeline announced under construction. To get these numbers higher, governments need to invest heavily in developing the necessary infrastructure for the grid. So it's developing new substations, it's constructing new transmission lines, it's implementing smart meters in homes, all of these things to ensure that the generation is able to connect to the transmission grid easier, and also ensure that the electricity is used as efficient as possible. Moving on to the next slide, please. And this is just something we hear a lot in LatAm, right? The import costs, import tariffs, especially in countries such as Brazil, that have some protectionist policies, make it almost basically impossible for new technologies to be developed in the country. It's just not feasible. And here in this graph, we see the estimated CapEx cost for battery storage solutions. This is dollar per kilowatt hour. So in Brazil right now, it's between 650 and $700 per kilowatt hour for battery storage solutions. Ideally, by 2035, if everything goes great and according to plan, that number is going to be down to $200. So that would be a significant improvement and would start making battery storage solutions with subsidies more feasible. But until then, battery storage solutions only make sense in markets where they're highly subsidized and where there's limited import tariffs. If we move on to the next slide. Oh, yeah, and that was the overview of the good, bad, and ugly. There's one specific part, the politics, that we did not mention. We don't have a slide for that, and I just wanted to touch upon briefly. So in Mexico, AMLO, who's nearing the end of his term next year, has been a pretty big nightmare for any private energy operator in the country. So at the expense of these private players, AMLO has been prioritizing the CFE, the state-owned utility, making it very, very hard for private players to connect to the grid, and delaying projects by 2 or 3 times as much as they usually take prior to AMLO. So a project to go from greenfield to ready to build in Mexico is estimated to take around 5 to 6 years, and before AMLO, it could be as quick as 2 years. So that delay is discouraging a lot of investors. It's making projects unfeasible, and it's also causing higher electricity costs for the Mexican population because there's not enough cheap, reliable electricity being offered by private operators, and country has to depend on the CFE, who actually can't supply all of the electricity. They can only supply around 60% of the electricity in the country before they have to rely on private operators. That's AMLO. He'll be gone in about a year and a half. The successor is still up in the air. But if it's Sheinbaum from the Morena party, we could expect more of the same. It's still unclear if she's just positioning herself as pretty extremist to get AMLO's approval, and then once she's elected, she'll tone down those views. There's Ebrard, which is the favorite among foreign investors and private companies, and there's Augusto, who's kind of in the middle ground there. Petro, he, like Lula, both very pro state intervention, growing the state, growing the presence of the state utilities. And that's coming at the expense of private operators, private distribution companies. It's cutting into their profits. We see in Colombia, actually, that Petro decided that the executive branch would set residential electricity tariffs instead of the energy regulators as set by the law. That's just not common. Petro is basically unhappy with the higher prices being charged by dams, which he claims are full, and so he's basically deciding to set the prices himself under the executive branch. That's a big problem. Before we jump into the Q&A, we'll actually stop here and ask for a poll question where we want to get a little bit of a sense of what you guys are interested in learning more when it comes to Latin American energy. So these are a few topics. Feel free to select as many as you want. Green hydrogen, oil, natural gas, distributed generation, political interference, clean fuels, battery storage, solar/wind, liquefied natural gas, or anything to do with midstream infrastructure. So please go ahead and answer that. A couple more seconds. That will help us give us some more direction on what you guys are interested in, what we should write about, what we should talk about. Okay, I think we can wrap up that poll. So interesting. It's 62% of you guys are interested in political interference risks in specific countries. 62% are interested in solar and wind. 54% in green hydrogen. 46% in midstream infrastructure, and then 54% in battery storage. So it seems like political risk, battery storage, solar and wind, and green hydrogen are the top priorities. Oil, natural gas, distributed generation, and LNG are less so. Interesting. Thanks for that. So now we'll open up the questions to the audience. I think we have a couple questions here. Abel, please go ahead whenever those come
Absolutely.
in.
Sure. So let's take a look at a couple that we have. One of them is from Alexandra. So she's saying that the IE projection of 45% increase in the next 5 years as far as renewable energy power seems a bit optimistic. So she's asking, where do they think the growth is going to happen? Is it going to be through large scale hydro, wind or solar, other low carbon areas? So that's her question.
Great question. Thank you, Alexandra. Appreciate it. Yeah, it is quite optimistic. There's no doubt about that. But I think there's multiple reasons behind that optimistic projection. First is the continued growth in demand. I think we're seeing almost 3% growth every year in electricity demand in LatAm. So that's going to have to be satisfied one way or the other. And renewables, of course, have the upper hand these days. I think most of that growth is going to happen in large scale wind or solar. Hydro, it seems, has faced a lot of community opposition, environmental opposition. It's becoming increasingly hard to develop hydro. Large scale hydro, you can do small scale hydro in certain locations, but large scale hydro is very, very complicated. Large scale solar and wind, even though it's going to be the bulk of it, is also going to be complemented by distributed generation, which I've been mentioning in the last couple of minutes. That's mostly on-site generation in factories or in homes and rooftops, and that's going to be actually a big bulk of that increased electricity supply. And I think lastly, there's also potential for waste to energy. I know it's a little bit less mature in many markets, but Brazil has passed regulation in recent months that are supposed to increase waste to energy solutions. And that's going to be using a lot of the biomass that we talked about for renewable fuels to also produce electricity. But yes, the bulk will come from large scale wind or solar, complemented by distributed generation, small hydro, and then a small part of waste to energy.
All right. So Bruno has a question, and it's what are the expectations for Brazil's energy sector under Lula?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so Lula, as many of you know, was Brazil's president for 2 terms in the early 2000s. The country did quite well, and that was a result of a commodity boom and many other factors. But now he's taken the realm when things are much more complicated. Debt to GDP is much higher, inflation is higher. There's a lot of challenges. He doesn't have a majority in Congress. There's a pretty strong opposition. And it seems like Lula is taking a more extremist stance compared to his first 2 terms. It seems like he's really pushing towards Petrobras growth in the energy sector. He mentioned potentially freezing some of the Petrobras fuel costs and not linking it to international prices. It doesn't seem like that's going to happen. That would be a very bad policy to move forward, because it would essentially lead Petrobras to sell fuel at a loss, and that would create very high levels of debt. That happened under Dilma, another president, and Petrobras became one of the most indebted companies in the world. Of course, there were some corruption issues and mismanagement as well that didn't help. But overall, we see very large state involvement, a focus on certain states that are pro-Lula. So that would be North and Northeast, where the president-elect won 70+% of the vote. That includes Ceará, Piauí, Rio Grande do Norte, Bahia, Pernambuco. all of these states are pro Lula, are expected to see the brunt of the investment almost as a thank you, and that's going to be a big focus on. That's going to be an offshore wind where they have very good wind resources. So that's what we see as in the broad strokes for Brazil under Lula.
All right, so shifting gears, this is more, I guess, pan-regional. Sandra asks, other than sustainable aviation fuel, what other solutions are there to decarbonize aviation?
Yeah, so aviation is one of those tricky sectors where there's not many solutions to decarbonize, and that's why sustainable aviation fuel is so attractive. I would say that the other solutions that are being worked on are electric planes, which are not really a reality right now because the battery weight is too heavy and wouldn't make it realistic to fly a plane under long haul flights, commercial flights with electric batteries. You can do short haul, private flights with electric batteries, but long haul commercial flights, the battery size would be too big, too heavy, it wouldn't make sense. The other solution is hydrogen, which I think has more potential, is still quite far away. I think Boeing is developing the most advanced hydrogen plane at this moment, and they don't expect to have a real commercial pilot ready before 2035. So from now until 2035, the real solution to decarbonize aviation is sustainable aviation fuel, and that's why we're seeing such a rush towards that. Basically, airlines can't get their hands on enough SAF because there's just not enough supply in the market. But if there was, they would definitely be buying more and more. But that's also going to have to be supported by government subsidies because right now SAF is more expensive than regular jet fuel.
All right. So, and with another specific fuel question, we have one from Pilar. What specific regions do you see doing the best in the production of green hydrogen, and why?
Yeah, so green hydrogen, there's a lot of factors that play a role, but I would say the most important is the low cost of renewable electricity. And the lowest cost of renewable electricity is found in northeast of Brazil, which has both wind and solar, and then the north and south of Chile. So those are the regions in specific that I see green hydrogen and the production of derivatives taking off. They also have pretty good access to export infrastructure in those locations, especially in the northeast of Brazil. So so make it easy to export those final products to Europe and Asia.
All righty. So you add some detail there about AMLO, and it's sort of uncertain what's going to happen after the sexennial is over. But I guess in the short term, Carlos had a question, which was, is there an opening in the Mexican power generation sector now? And if so, where would that be?
Good question, Carlos. Yeah, the opening is quite small. It's quite slight. Basically, the regulatory agency in Mexico, CRE, resumed the normal procedure times to issue permits, but they capped the amount of permits that they will review basically at a very small number. So it's 15 per month for electricity, and I think it's 45 for hydrocarbon related projects. So that's a tiny amount compared to what is actually needed in Mexico for increased generation. But it's a sign that they realize that they need to start resuming some of the standard operations that they had prior to COVID. They've been using COVID as a reason to sit on permits and delay projects. And the CFE, which is a state-owned utility company, simply can't produce electricity fast enough or at scale enough to supply the country. So the short answer is yes, very slight opening, but before you go into Mexico, you need to look into several different things, right? The ideal location to set up your plant, who you should partner with locally, what are your competitors doing, what kind of offtake agreements do they have? Are they selling it to the state-owned utility? Are they selling their electricity to end users? Are they exporting that electricity to the US? All those things are very important prior to deciding to set up a generation plant in Mexico.
Right. So it seems like a lot of due diligence is going to be required before making that kind of move. And I guess the market intelligence would come in handy for that sort of thing, so you can make the right decision. Right. So makes total sense. So Ronald has another question, and also about a specific market. So he's asking, what is the status of the oil auctions planned in Guyana this year, and what is happening in Suriname?
Good questions. Yeah, so the Guyana, which if you guys have come to these webinars before, is something we've talked about in the past, is a country that's discovered the largest offshore discoveries, oil discoveries in the world in the last 10 years. They're going to auction 14 different blocks around those initial discoveries at the end of April. So there's been a lot of interest from the big oil players, Chevron, Shell, Exxon, or have all bought the seismic data prior to the auction to determine whether or not you're going to participate. It looks like there's also going to be involvement from some of the Middle East oil players in those auctions, and the contract for those auctions have been modified compared to what the initial contract was for the original oil blocks in Guyana. So the royalties that are going to have to be paid for the government have gone up from 2 to 10%. The government share of profit oil has also increased significantly. So the terms are not as attractive as they initially were in the first exploration blocks, but Guyana still is a very attractive jurisdiction if you're looking to find cheap and low and high quality oil.
And what about Suriname?
Oh yeah, in Suriname, yeah, basically there in Suriname, they're waiting for a final investment decision from Total, who's the leading operator in the exploration of the offshore blocks. It seems like Total is dragging their feet. The reason why it's not entirely clear, I think it's what we've heard from different sources, is that internally they're not sure how Suriname fits into their wider decarbonization strategy. They don't know if they want to invest billions of dollars in 20 years in developing an oil and gas resource in a country such as Suriname, which is quite complicated. There's lots of inflation, challenges with politics, lack of infrastructure, all of that. So I think that's one part of it. And then the second part of it is that the seismic data that they've collected from the initial drill tests have come out quite unclear in terms of the quality of the crude, how much there is. So I think they're still determining internally and doing further drill tests to decide whether or not they make a final investment decision. I expect that to happen before the end of the year.
Okay, so Pablo has another specific market question, and that would be, what about Argentina? So what he says is, beyond non-conventional gas in Vaca Muerta and the pipeline infrastructure announced this year, is there any relevant movement on renewables, GH2, e-fuels to account for, or is everything pretty much on hold until after the elections?
Thank you, Pablo. Appreciate the question. Yeah, the reality is that we haven't been focusing on Argentina that much for several reasons. But what we've seen in from the few conversations we've had is that things do seem to be on hold until there is more clarity on the next presidential election and midterm elections as well. As we know, Argentina has a lot of potential for wind in the Patagonia region, in the Jujuy region. Solar in some places less so, but if they can really develop the infrastructure around the Jujuy region for low cost wind, they can definitely produce some of the hydrogen derivatives that we've been talking about. So methanol, ammonia, produce e-fuels, and then export that to Europe and other larger markets. Argentina is always a country, unfortunately, that's been challenged due to its politics, right? Like many countries in Latin America, but even worse so in Argentina, and that's holding back a lot of its renewable development. Under Macri, there was some renewable auctions that scaled up the installed capacity of both solar and wind, but those auctions were kind of put into hold under the Fernandez administration, and it's still unclear what's going to happen next. So yeah, Argentina is pretty much a wait and see until there's more clarity on the political front. The good news is that gas in Vaca Muerta is really growing rapidly. Of course, it's being heavily subsidized by the government, but that's still a good sign that they were able to kind of reignite some of the exploration and production of gas there.
All right. Well, we have basically exhausted our questions, and I think we've gone over time a little bit more than more or less. We said 30 to 45 minutes, so we're kind of at that 45-minute mark. So we actually haven't gone over time quite yet. So I think we're kind of wrapped up for now. So I'd like to turn the floor over to you, Arthur, just to sign us off, and hopefully you could join us at future events down the line.
For sure. Thank you, Abel. Yeah, just wanted to wrap up. Thank all of you guys for your time, your participation. I appreciate the questions. They were very interesting, got me thinking. And hopefully, if there's any other questions that come up, please do reach out to us. Here's my contact information. You know where to find us. And looking forward to speaking to all of you guys in the next event. Thank you very much.